Right, moving on to the third topic this week, and some of the people who watch us regularly may have noticed that the 10x6 image from behind me is gone this week, and the picture or image of a young Bob Dylan, Mr. Robert Zimmerman, has replaced it for 1 week only. So why do you think we've got the image of Bob Dylan behind me then, Tom?
Was it a special birthday for Bob this week, I think, Jace, wasn't it?
It was a special birthday, yeah. His 80th. Incredible, really. This, a guy who, I mean, when you look at the long list of things that you can associate with Bob Dylan, and actually it's, for most people, it's a singer-songwriter growing up. But as he's got older and his interests become more multifarious and varied, if I just go through him, what is he? He's a singer-songwriter. He's an activist. He's a poet. He's a visual artist. He's a cultural icon. He's a radio presenter and a Nobel Prize winner. And then I'll probably only just scratch the surface, in terms of what he represents. And he is somebody who started to sort of hit the scene in New York and Greenwich Village, late 1950s, early 1960s. Suddenly, he went from being no one to having an album that set him on the way in terms of being one of the major folk stars on the planet. Then, obviously, in 1966, he made that transition to a rather, should we say, upset group of people when he made that transition from folk to electric. So he played the first half of the gig with acoustic guitar, and then in the second half, he brought on a band and he played with an electric guitar and all the boos that were ringing out, which can still be picked up on some of the live albums that have been released from around that time. But very quickly he was able to embrace the electric. Obviously, he had the band, which in themselves became, as a discrete entity, a really popular group. And it didn't curtail him. He went from strength to strength. All right, the albums, the music he released has been very varied. I mean, another brilliant title I saw is 60 Years of Relentless Reinvention. That really does, holistically, that really does help us to understand the Bob Dylan. And there's something else. I mean, we can all talk about his music. We can all talk about the favorite albums, favorite songs. And I mean, you put up a post yourself, didn't you, on social media? And I considered it, and I think ultimately, in terms of Bob Dylan, it's a mood thing. I mean, people can say "Tangled Up in Blue," for example, from Blood on the Tracks, fantastic song. I love that song. But different moods, different times, and there's other songs from across the whole spectrum that just nail that moment. So I say I wouldn't want to sit here. People must go on and do their own investigations themselves if they haven't really come in contact with Bob Dylan much and his music before, and find out for themselves. This is not for us to say, go here, start here. But I'll just want to show you something else in terms of Bob Dylan, that I was introduced to purely by accident, really. I read an article 3 years ago that talked about Bob Dylan's own artwork. And I found this article earlier, just searching through. This is a piece of Bob's art. And then you move on, say, onto this picture, this barroom scene. It's in terms of the detail, if somebody said, you know, this is from a major artist, and people look at that and go, wow, but they don't realize that actually that Bob Dylan has become in himself a major artist. We went to the Housing Museum, I think it was in 2018 in London, I think near Piccadilly Circus. I can't remember the exact detail. And we saw, you know, the whole thing was dedicated to his art, and his art varies. I mean, this image here, there was a life-size model of this art that had been constructed purely out of different types of metal. So it's not like he's rigidly into portrait artistry or whatever. And then here we go. There's a scene from a particular museum in terms of the artwork on the walls, his designated artwork. And look at that. And that again is, you know, phenomenal. So what I think, you know, what we tend to do is we tend to pigeonhole, don't we? You know, we sort of hear the nature of somebody, and we pigeonhole them straight away. They're this, and then they can't be also that. Whereas in Bob Dylan's case, he is so much.
Yeah,
absolutely. So that's what makes him so extraordinary. And just finishing off, sort of my perspective, going back to the 1960s with him and people like Joan Baez, and they were there when Martin Luther King made his pronouncements. And they were part of that civil rights movement that sought to liberate everybody. So that it was non-whites, women, etc. And obviously around the Vietnam time too. And stand up together and unite and respect and love each other. And of course, what happened was in the 1970s was there's a massive kickback against that movement with the Nixon government, etc., going there right through into the 1980s with Ronald Reagan. And Bob Dylan always distanced himself in that he didn't want to be perceived to be the activist singer, in that he was at the vanguard. He never wanted that label. He wanted to be part of the scene alongside so many other people, but he hated the idea of somebody saying, you know, right at the front is Bob Dylan, which is, I think, is such a testimony to him, to say, I want to be part of the people. I am one of the people, but I'm not the person. And what's your take on Bob? Because I know you're a big fan too from your background.
I am, and you know, ever since when I was very little, you know, my brother had my late brother loved his music and was a big fan of Dylan's, and so I was sort of introduced to Dylan via my brother, particularly, parents as well to an extent. So yeah, and as you say, I posted something this week with the lyrics to Chimes of Freedom, which is my sort of personal favourite Dylan track, in that it just gives me goosebumps, being a sort of track about, more than anything, that sort of cries out for justice for people that are suffering in the world, people that are downtrodden, that are underdogs, that are oppressed in one way or another. And it's stunningly beautiful song, true poetry, and always just gives me goosebumps, makes me feel emotional. So yeah, that was fascinating, Jace. I mean, you know a lot more about Dylan than I do, but I didn't know about his art, you know, his physical art. That was fascinating to see. And yeah, and it's extraordinary to think, I mean, we will say how time flies. It's staggering he's 80. I mean, I kind of associate Dylan with the, you know, the seminal video of him doing Love Terranian Homesick Blues with the cards, you know, dropping the cards down with the lyrics. And he was a young man then. He was, you know, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed young man, and hard to believe that he's 80. But as you say, in terms of a body of work, constantly reinventing himself and presenting us with a body of work as an artist, there's very few modern artists and performers and writers that can match Dylan. And of course, as well as the things, his own work that he's famous for, he also penned things that became famous because they were sung, performed by other people. I mean, in
Of
particular,
course.
there's Adele's, forgot the name of it now. What was the famous Adele song that was written by Dylan? To Make You Feel My Love. So probably most people know that as an Adele song, but of course it was written and first performed by Dylan, who then agreed for Adele to cover it, and it became a massive hit. I mean, staggeringly beautiful love song, essentially. So yeah, you've actually you've been to a couple of Dylan concerts over the years. How was that as an experience?
Yeah, I mean, I was introduced to Bob Dylan from a friend and colleague at work when I was teaching, many years ago, and he said, "Right, come on, Dylan's touring. He's playing in Cardiff. Come and see him." So us two went off. We met up with this particular person's father, who's been introduced his son to Bob Dylan. So it was an amazing experience, because you're going to see a cultural icon who it's just an arena full of people all shouting, "Bob, we love you, Bob." Do you know what I mean? And there's people. I remember going in the car for the last journey with my friend's dad, and they were in the front seats discussing it, and they were talking what the set list would probably be like, and also they looked at online, and they looked at some whatever journals or whatever from his previous gigs on this tour, and they'd already got an idea of the texture, if you like, of what the concert would be. And also the other thing is then I saw him much later in Bournemouth. But it is interesting because you listen to some people who haven't seen Dylan before, and then they go along and they say, "Oh, I was really disappointed. His voice isn't as great as it was, and he played every song on the piano. He didn't necessarily play the ones that I was expecting." But that is Bob Dylan. It's not like it's a take that reunion, where you've got this small quantity of songs that you just repeat over and over and over and spew out to those people who demand it. Bob Dylan's written hundreds, if not thousands, of songs. He's presented them in a whole range of different ways, whether it be on the acoustic guitar, whether it be with electric guitar of a band, whether it be on a piano, etc. So he does it as his mood takes. He tours eternally, but he doesn't tour eternally so he can play the same songs every night in the same way. He does it so he can go on and improvise and still get some pleasure out of doing the experience, which you don't do if you do 60 years of singing, Hard Rain's Gonna Fall or Desolation Row on an acoustic guitar doing it exactly the same way. Desolation Row, just to finish off this particular bit, I suggest to anybody to go and put on Desolation Row after this program, listen to the whole song, and then at the end, I want you to remind yourself, or just to take on board, he wrote this song in the back of a taxi. These complicated lyrics, this story, amazing story about a hanging. And he wrote the song in the back of a taxi back in the 1960s. Incredible. It takes a certain kind of pedigree to write a song like that in the way he wrote it. And then, of course, I'm completely in awe, as I've made the point to you before, of being able to write sophisticated songs and then remember them all, to go on stage and every, not just the words in the right places, but the nuance. What you're trying to get through from the lyrics of that song. Just amazing. Right.
I mean, I think you just reminded me also when you mentioned about going to see something like Take That and they just play their greatest hits. It reminded me of that wonderful Alan Partridge line where someone says to him, what's your favourite Beatles album? And he goes, I think the best of Beatles.
Yeah.
Oh, dear. So yeah, it's not like that when you go and see Bob Dylan. It's not going to be the best of.
No,
But yeah,
no,
and
because
and and
so
have
the people that come to see Bob Dylan, a lot of them
yeah,
are it's a new experience for them. But there's a lot of them there who've seen him dozens, if not hundreds of times, and actually they go. There's two different audiences. The audience who've seen him hundreds of times want to see or hear different songs, and if they hear the same song, they want to hear and see them done in a different way. Whereas new ones, like you say, they just want the ones that I've heard on the radio a lot. And so you've got almost a conflict within the audience of expectation.